The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as the bus pulled into the dusty little town. It was a place where not much changed, where life moved slowly and people recognized each other by the sound of their footsteps. But for one man, today felt like the first day of his life. Dressed in his slightly wrinkled army uniform, with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he stepped off the bus with a hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his weathered face. The smell of dry earth and distant wood smoke filled his lungs, grounding him back in the reality of home. He looked around eagerly, scanning the small crowd of townsfolk waiting at the station. There were warm hugs and joyful reunions all around, but none for him. His wife had promised to be there. She had told him that their daughter had been counting down the days until his return. But as minutes passed and the platform slowly emptied, no familiar face appeared. Still, he didn't panic. Maybe they were running late. Maybe his daughter had fallen asleep. He adjusted his bag and began walking, boots crunching along the gravel path leading out of town and toward the edge, where their small farmhouse stood. With each step, his anticipation grew. He imagined his daughter running toward him barefoot, arms outstretched, squealing, "Daddy," as she had in the videos his wife used to send. He thought of the flowers he'd picked up at a roadside stand just outside the base, a mix of wild daisies and sunflowers, clumsily wrapped in twine. He held them carefully in his hand, picturing the joy on her face when he gave them to her. But the closer he got to the house, the more that warm feeling began to fade. The front gate was broken, hanging on one hinge, and the garden he'd spent so many weekends planting was overgrown with weeds. The porch light was off. No smoke came from the chimney. The house, usually so welcoming, looked abandoned. He stopped at the fence, eyes narrowing, his instincts tightening like a coil. Something wasn't right. He called out. Once, twice. No answer. He pushed the gate open and it gave a loud creak, startling a stray chicken that ran past him into the overgrown yard. As he stepped onto the porch, he knocked on the door and waited. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. He gently opened the door. It wasn't locked. The house was cold and quiet inside. Dust floated through the beams of fading light. There were dishes in the sink, but no sign of life. A lone photograph of his daughter sat on the windowsill, half faded and slightly bent. Heart pounding, he set down his duffel bag and the flowers on the table and stepped back outside. Maybe she was out back, feeding the animals. Maybe his wife was in the garden. But as he walked past the silent swing set and toward the barn, he noticed something strange, the sound of pigs grunting, and another softer sound, like breathing. A child's breathing. He followed the sound slowly, cautiously. The door to the pigsty was ajar. He pushed it open, and what he saw rooted him to the spot. There, nestled among hay and beside a sleeping sow, was his daughter. She looked smaller than he remembered, curled up in a fetal position, wearing clothes that were too thin for the cool evening air. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks smeared with dirt. But it was her. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked confused, blinking up at him. Then her face lit up with a fragile hope, and she whispered, "Daddy." He dropped to his knees, unable to speak, and gathered her in his arms. Nothing in the world made sense, but she was alive. She was here. And he was finally home. The sight of his daughter sleeping in a pigsty sent a shockwave through him so fierce, he couldn't move at first. His knees hit the dirt beside her, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The girl stirred again, this time more alert, and when she realized it wasn't a dream, that her father was really there, she threw her arms around his neck and clung to him with a quiet desperation that broke his heart. Her tiny frame trembled against him, and though her body was caked with grime, he held her tighter, as if to shield her from every bad thing that had ever happened in his absence. "Why are you here?" he asked gently, brushing a strand of tangled hair from her face. She looked up at him, confused by the question. "This is where I sleep now," she said with a shrug, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. The pigs shuffled in the background, grunting softly as they moved through the straw. He looked around the small enclosure. There was no blanket, just a burlap sack half covered in straw, a half-eaten apple, and what looked like an empty water bottle. His daughter had been living like this. Sleeping beside livestock, exposed to the elements, without warmth, without safety. He fought back the rising wave of fury building inside him. Not at her. Not even at the pigs. At whoever allowed this. At whoever left her here. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. The girl shrugged again, this time without meeting his gaze. She goes away a lot. Sometimes for days. I stay here because it's warm. Warm. That single word shattered him. His daughter, his little girl who should have been sleeping in her soft bed with a nightlight and stuffed animals, had chosen the pigsty because it was warm. He stood up, cradling her in his arms, and carried her out of the barn. The sun had fully set now, and the shadows stretched long across the yard. As he stepped back toward the house, neighbors began to appear on porches, watching. Whispers traveled across fences, behind curtains. Eyes followed him, some full of shame, others curiosity. Not one had come forward when he arrived. Not one had tried to warn him. Did no one see? He asked loudly, addressing the silence around him. Did no one think to help her? The old man from next door stepped off his porch, hat in hand. We thought she was being taken care of, he said quietly. Didn't know how bad it got. She's a child. The father snapped. She was living in a pigsty. An older woman joined the man, her face pale. We tried talking to your wife once or twice. She wouldn't have it. Said we should mind our business. He looked at his daughter, now clinging tightly to his jacket, her eyes still wide and frightened. Her small fingers gripped the fabric like it was her lifeline. He wanted answers, but right now, more than anything, she needed to be cleaned, fed, and held. He carried her inside the house, brushing away cobwebs as he entered. The smell of neglect hung heavy in the air, mildew, rot, dust. He set her down gently on the couch and knelt in front of her. You're safe now. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded, but her eyes didn't fully trust that promise yet. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. As he started a fire and poured her a glass of water, she watched him like he was something unfamiliar, something she wanted to believe in but wasn't sure she could. And all he could think was how in the world he would fix the damage done, not just to the home, but to her spirit. The next morning brought no peace, only more questions. The father barely slept, choosing instead to sit by his daughter's side as she lay curled up on the couch under a pile of old blankets he had dug out from the linen closet. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion taking over, but he remained alert, haunted by the image of her nestled among the pigs. Each time he closed his eyes, it returned with brutal clarity. By dawn, he was outside. The sun was rising slowly, casting golden streaks over the yard that now looked less like home and more like the remains of a life that had unraveled. He checked the barn again, then circled the house, searching for anything, any sign of his wife, any note, any clue. Nothing. The silence hung heavy, interrupted only by the distant sounds of mourning, roosters crowing, dogs barking, doors creaking open down the road. He walked to the front gate and leaned on it, staring out at the road that had once brought him joy and now felt like a trail of unanswered pain. It wasn't long before a few neighbors cautiously made their way over. They didn't speak right away. One by one, they stood near the fence, avoiding his eyes, clutching mugs of coffee or holding their hats in their hands as though preparing for a funeral. Finally, it was Mrs. Parker, the older widow who lived 2 houses down, who spoke. We were hoping you'd come back soon, she said gently. But none of us expected, she trailed off, her voice failing her. The father turned to her, his eyes red but steady. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't anyone write or call? You knew. The silence was loud. A few people looked down. Mr. Halbert, who ran the feed store, stepped forward with a guilty expression. We thought your wife had things handled. She told everyone you didn't want people meddling in your business. When folks asked questions, she shut them down hard. She said you didn't want letters, Mrs. Parker added quietly. That you'd said not to bother you while you were deployed. That everything was fine here. I never said that, he said through clenched teeth. Not once. I would have come home in a heartbeat if I knew. An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the small group. A few more neighbors stepped closer now, emboldened by his openness. One man mentioned seeing the little girl wandering alone some afternoons, picking through garbage bins, but every time he brought it up, her mother got defensive. Another recalled seeing the girl fall asleep on the church steps during evening prayer, but by the time anyone acted, she would vanish again. He listened, growing more devastated with each revelation. So you all noticed something was wrong, he said bitterly. But you did nothing. We're sorry, someone whispered. But the words sounded small, useless. What happened to her? He asked finally, his voice cracking. Where is she? No one could answer at first. Then, the man who worked part-time for the sheriff stepped forward. Your wife was seen getting into a car with some guy a few weeks back. They haven't been seen since. We figured she went to her sister's in the city, maybe left the girl with someone. We didn't know she left her here, alone. He rubbed his face with both hands, the weight of it all sinking in. Abandonment. Lies. The failure of an entire community. And in the middle of it, his daughter, innocent, vulnerable, and betrayed by every adult who should have protected her. I need to know everything, he said at last. Where she went, who she left with. I don't care how long it takes. And just like that, the tired soldier who came home for peace found himself preparing for a different kind of war. One not fought with weapons, but with truth, justice, and the fierce determination of a father who had been kept in the dark for far too long. He spent the rest of the day searching for more than just answers, he was searching for the truth he'd been denied for far too long. His daughter still slept, her breathing shallow but steady, as he stepped onto the porch and stared down the dusty road. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, not from the neighbors who had stayed silent, but from someone who might still have some shred of loyalty left. He walked to the edge of town where an old friend, Mark Bennett, lived, a man he'd trusted before the war, who had once called himself his brother in everything but blood. Mark had known his wife well, too well perhaps. There had always been something off in the way they spoke to each other, something he'd ignored at the time. When Mark opened the door, his eyes widened in surprise. You're back. The father didn't smile. I need answers, Mark. And I think you have them. Mark's face tightened. About what? You know exactly what. About my daughter. About why she's been living in a damn pigsty while her mother vanished into thin air. For a moment, Mark said nothing. Then he stepped aside. Come in. The house was clean and quiet, the way his should have been. They sat at the kitchen table, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mark sighed and looked him in the eye. She started changing not long after you left, he said. At first, she was just struggling, lonely, scared. But then she stopped answering calls from your folks. Stopped sending your letters. She told people she didn't hear from you anymore, that you'd moved on. But I knew that wasn't true. I saw the way she'd talk about you before. Something was wrong. Was she seeing someone? The father asked sharply. Mark nodded slowly. A guy from out of town. She met him at the bar, I think. He wasn't right. Slick type. Showed up in a black car, always stayed just long enough to stir up trouble. I told her he was no good, but she didn't listen. The father clenched his fists under the table. And my daughter. Did you know she was left alone? I didn't know she was alone, Mark said, his voice cracking. I thought maybe she left her with someone. You know how rumors spread around here. People said she'd taken the kid to her sister's place, others said she put her in some kind of care. No one checked, the father muttered bitterly. Not even you. I'm sorry, Mark said quietly. I should have. I didn't think. No, you didn't, he snapped. Then, softening slightly, he added, but now I need to find her. My wife. That man. Anyone who let this happen. Mark nodded. I'll help. I know a guy who works near the county line, he might have seen that car. I'll make some calls. Back at the house, his daughter had woken up and was sitting by the window, clutching a doll he didn't recognize. When he walked in, she looked at him with wide, searching eyes. Where's Mama? She asked. He knelt down beside her, steadying his voice. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. And you're not going to be left alone again. I promise. She looked down, her small fingers gripping the doll tighter. He lifted her gently into his arms and whispered, we'll fix this. I don't know how yet, but we will. One day at a time. The truth had begun to unravel, piece by piece. And though it hurt more with every discovery, he was ready. Because nothing mattered more than protecting the little girl who had already survived too much, and giving her the life she had been so cruelly denied. He stood in the kitchen, his hands steady as he washed the dirt from a bowl of fruit. The silence in the house was different now, not hollow or forgotten, but filled with a quiet sense of rebuilding. His daughter sat at the small table, legs swinging under the chair, watching him with curious eyes. Her hair was damp and combed, her face finally clean, her clothes fresh from a box he'd found tucked away in a bedroom closet. For the first time in what felt like forever, she looked like a little girl again. But the shadows hadn't fully left her eyes. He placed a plate of sliced apples and toast in front of her and sat across the table. She took a bite slowly, glancing at him between chews, still unsure if he was real or if this was just another dream that would disappear in the morning. He didn't speak right away. He just watched her eat, letting the rhythm of normalcy settle between them. There was no point in forcing words or promises. She needed to feel that things were different now, not hear it, feel it. And so he stayed there with her, present in a way he hadn't been allowed to be for so long. Outside, the neighbors passed by slowly. Some offered nods of guilt or sympathy through the windows, others simply looked away. They had expected a scene. They had expected him to break something, to scream, to storm out and demand answers from every person who had failed his daughter. But he hadn't. When he first brought her out of that pigsty, many had stood in anticipation, bracing themselves for a soldier's rage. What they saw instead left them speechless. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't lashed out. He had simply carried her, quietly, carefully, like she was made of glass. He had lit a fire, prepared food, and began cleaning the mess she had been forced to survive in. They didn't understand it. They expected fury. What they witnessed was love. And love, in its quietest and most determined form, was far more disarming. After breakfast, he helped her into a pair of shoes and gently guided her outside. The air was fresh with morning dew, and the trees cast long shadows across the yard. She hesitated at the porch, uncertain. "You want to help me fix the swing?" he asked softly. Her face lit up just a little. She nodded. Together, they walked over to the rusted swing set. One of the chains had snapped, the other hung at a crooked angle. He knelt beside it, pulling tools from the shed while she stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself. As he worked, he talked. About nothing at first. About the birds, the color of the sky, the dog he'd had as a boy. Slowly, she began to answer. One word, then two, then a sentence. The swing was fixed by noon, and she climbed into it with a timid smile. As he pushed her gently back and forth, she looked over her shoulder at him. "Are you mad at Mama?" she asked. He hesitated. "No," he said finally. "I'm just glad I'm here now. And that you are too." She nodded and looked forward again, her small body leaning into the swing's motion. The sunlight caught in her hair, and for a fleeting moment, she looked weightless. Inside, the house still bore the scars of neglect. But he would fix it. One room at a time. One day at a time. He had no idea what lay ahead, what legal battles, what truth still needed to surface, but one thing was certain. He had come home a soldier, but now, he would stay a father.